and diabetes patients from the new rolled out Social Health Insurance Fund. Now, this move leaves these patients reliant on donors who are already withdrawing from the country. These concerns emerged during a conference aimed at developing strategies for investment in reproductive health among young people, with the goal of eliminating HIV infections, early pregnancies, and sexual and gender-based violence. Robbie Omondi reports.
As Kenya aims to eliminate mother-to-child transmission of HIV/AIDS by 2027, concerns have been raised regarding the new Social Health Insurance Fund, which does not cover for HIV and AIDS patients or those with diabetes.
This will mean that as a country we are going to miss out supporting very critical people, more than 1.3 people living with HIV in this country, and about 100 to 120 people who get TB every year. Family planning, if it's excluded from SHA, that means many more. And it will mean many more unplanned pregnancies, many more illegal abortions, and the consequences that follow in the society.
This development comes even as the government insists that the transition to the new fund is legal and that all Kenyans will soon fully benefit from it.
Sasa hivi wale ambao wamejisajili ni watu milioni 2.3. Siku ya mwisho tarehe 30 Septemba watu waliojisajili ni 1150 kwa siku moja. Isajili kwa sababu tunanuia kusajili zaidi ya watu milioni 12, alafu ndio tuweze kuwa tumecover hii bima ishughulikie wa Kenya zaidi ya milioni 53.
During a stakeholders conference, it emerged that addressing HIV/AIDS, early pregnancies and sexual violence requires a unified approach, as these issues pose a setback to reproductive health efforts among young people.
The vulnerability of a girl who gets pregnant, drops out of school, if she doesn't get HIV, she then struggles to feed the baby, struggles to get the diapers, she gets HIV because then she begins to have sex for those things. So these things begin to get connected.
For instance, despite Homa Bay County having the highest rates of HIV/AIDS, it also leads in reducing mother-to-child transmission cases.
Kenya is the 4th highest burden of HIV on the continent. If we can succeed in Homa Bay, that tells us we can succeed in Kenya. And when we're succeeding in Kenya, it's a message for the rest of the continent and the rest of the world.
To this end, the government has been called upon to invest more in reproductive health.
We just recently met a boy of 17 years old with 8 children, and we were asking him, so what has it been, why? And he said, my first child, I got him at 14 years. And as he was trying to describe all these girls he's had sex with, he said that, but they were coming to me because they needed sanitary towels. And so he didn't see his role as being that of a perpetrator. He saw his role as being a giver.
So we really focus on ensuring domestic financing for health across the continent, hence the need for the political commitment in the work that we do.
Robbie Omondi, K24.
All right, that story by Robbie Omondi, of course, takes us to our conversation here tonight on what has been happening in the country as far as the transfer of patients from NHIF to the Social Health Authority is concerned, because a lot of questions have been raised, and I want to start by this. Under Section 25 of under Section 25 rather, data can only be processed if there is a lawful basis, such as explicit consent from the data subject. I want to speak to my guest here tonight, who is Amit Gadia, an advocate when it comes to matters to do with data protection. Thank you so much for making time tonight.
Thank you, Brian.
I want us to start with this one. Yesterday, a lot of people received messages to this particular effect of transferring their data from NHIF all the way to the Social Health Authority. Was there any law broken in that particular process?
First of all, let's talk about a little bit of history about data protection. Data protection essentially stems from human rights. If you look at the history of data protection all the way from World War II to date, it's all about how you protect human rights. Fast forward to 2024, our Data Protection Act is just under 5 years old. In fact, the Data Protection Act is going to be 5 years old in November 2024. Okay. But the constitutional right to privacy exists under the Article 31 of the Constitution of Kenya since 2010. However, there is a misconception that who owns your personal data. So to make the notion very clear, is the data subject, the individual owns the personal data. So with that backdrop, even before you talk about lawful basis, right, is the individual is the lawful owner. If you're a lawful owner of the currency, your currency, you should be asked by anybody, how are you going to use my personal data? Okay. Consent is not the only lawful basis. However, if you are processing personal data without going into any form of technicalities, if you are processing sensitive personal data, especially health data, children's data, if you are going to be using data for direct marketing purposes, you need consent. So when we talk about consent, consent again is not the only lawful basis, but again, essentially, you cannot waive consent. More importantly, you have to ensure that you as the individual understand what your data is being used for. Okay, so in this scenario, a lot of Kenyans have been out here saying, I did not consent to this, and there was no that clear communication in regards to whether your data is what this data is going to be used for. So how do we navigate this particular issue? In my opinion, there should have been a few steps taken. Before that, there should have been at least some form of public consultation taken place. At least the individual should have been made aware what their rights are. Data protection is all about individual rights, your rights, my rights. Your data belongs to you, because if somebody is going to be using your data, you should know what it's being used for. So essentially, the public should have been made aware. I mean, if I come to you and say, okay, I'm going to use your voice, your name, your ID number, right? That's your personal data. So and you're going to be consenting for it. What are you going to consent for? Do you know what you're consenting for? So has that, the information obligations in the Kenya Data Protection Act, have they been relayed to you before you consent to? What are you going to consent to? Okay, so public participation was important for people to be made to understand where their data is being taken. And the Ministry of Health somehow has come out and said, you see, there's no illegality that was committed here. Is there a misunderstanding? What are we looking at? First of all, let's talk about, when we talk about Data Protection Act, there are very few exemptions. The exemptions are very narrow. For example, for national security, and other public interests, the government is not exempt, right, from the Data Protection Act. So, when you talk about illegality, it depends what sort of illegality you are talking about. Are they really talking about that they do not have the right to process that data? Do they not have their have they not abided by the principles of data protection? If you look at the data protection internationally, even like just this week, the police in Northern Ireland was fined $1 million for not adhering to data subject rights. So internationally, governments are being held accountable to data protection laws. So, does that mean the government can be held accountable for what has happened this time round? Yes, if they're found to be in violation, right? But again, what sort of violation are we talking about here? One thing I'd like to bring to your attention is when you are processing sensitive personal data. If you may recall, a few years back, we had the Huduma rollout by the previous Jubilee government. That rollout was thrown, the Huduma judgment, the Huduma number rollout was thrown out because for the lack of a data protection impact assessment. So essentially, they are required to a data protection impact assessment before they proceed to. Okay, now one argument could be made here is that you see, the government already had this particular data. Does that mean when I give the government my data, they are free to do with it whatever they want? Because it is NHIF to now shift. Yeah. Does that mean that now that I had consented to NHIF, if they want to change the authority, they can actually go ahead and do that? If they want to change the authority, again, as I said, they go to the right lawful basis, they go to abide by the principles of data protection, and to make sure they make you aware of why they are changing. Okay. Right? There are certain, I believe there are some certain transition clauses, right, which they allow them to do that, but it is important that for the public to understand what is being done. Right. Yeah. As we finalize, what are the legal redress that people can seek? If somebody, a Kenyan, because we've been able to see quite a number that are saying, okay, I feel like my rights have been violated in this particular essence. So when they want to seek redress on this particular issue, how do they go about it? Where do they start? What do they cite? I would say you start, first of all, with the government organization itself, and then really they should have a complaints procedure. So as an individual, you have rights to your data. So essentially you can ask, look, what data are we processing, how are you processing my data, what's the purpose you're using it for, and then how do you eventually dispose of my data, right? But then those, they're meant to come back to you, the government's meant to come back to you within a certain time frame. If really it fails, you have the complaints procedure with the Commissioner's Office, the Office of Data Protection Commissioner, which they have their complaints resolution procedure as well.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Amit Gadia, for making time to just help us make sense of this particular conversation, and whether if somebody feels like they've been violated when it comes to their rights, whether they can actually go to court, because there's quite a number of petitions that people have already started filing as far as this is concerned, and that concern of whether the government has my right, my data, they are free to do whatever they want with that. I do thank you. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
All right, we do want to take a break here on Evening Edition. Don't go too far. When we come back, we'll be taking you through some of the day's stories and also some sporting action. Don't go too far.
Back to the future. The future is simulate. Bet smarter. Win faster now. Be a winner. Mozart.bet.
As you wait for your call to be picked, here is today's inspirational quote. Life is a roller coaster, full of good days